This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals, a podcast of climate ecology and animal justice, where we use books to think about our environmental crisis and what may come next. This is episode 2 of season 2, and it is the second episode in the series I am doing on the concept of animal agency. So last episode we talked about non-human creativity, and this episode we're talking about non-human politics and what it looks like to engage with other animals as political agents. So my guest to talk about this, I'm very excited, is Eva Meijer. She is a writer, an artist, a songwriter, novelist, a philosopher, the author of a nonfiction book called When Animals Speak, Toward an Interspecies Democracy. She's the author of many other books as well, but that's the one we're going to talk about. It's one of my favorite interviews I've done for the show, and I think connects a lot of dots that have come up throughout the 40 plus episodes of the show I have done, both talking about other animals as agents, as subjects of their own life, but also about ways we can make our democracy more democratic and how that might help us confront the issues we face, not only to help non-humans, but to help humans as well. In fact, this August I will be starting a PhD program in environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, and some of the questions discussed in this interview are the sorts of questions that I hope to explore getting my PhD. How can we transform our political systems to be more inclusive of not only humans but other species as well? So I hope you enjoy. The best way to support this podcast would be through subscribing via Patreon, making a small monthly donation as little as $4 a month. That's $2 an episode. And yeah, go to patreon.com/storytellingpod. You'll get early access to episodes, membership in the book club, or other perks depending on what level you subscribe at. You can also sign up for my free weekly newsletter, and that gets you a free trial membership in the book club as well. Our next meeting is going to be June 27th, that's a Tuesday at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific, to discuss the novel The Plague Dogs by Richard Adams. Some of you may remember Adams as the author of Watership Down, a very important novel in, I'm sure, many of our youths. But The Plague Dogs is another novel by him. It's about dogs escaping from an animal research facility, so it'll be an opportunity to discuss non-humans in fiction as well as animal research and other issues. So yeah, if you're interested in that book club, either subscribe on Patreon, subscribe to the newsletter, reach out to me directly, and we can figure something out. Alright, without further ado, here is Eva Meijer. Hi, I'm here with Eva Meijer, the author of When Animals Speak, Toward an Interspecies Democracy, and of many other books as well, which we may touch on. So Eva, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot we can talk about, but maybe we can start with just how did you become interested in this question of how other animals relate to politics and democracy?
Well, I think that for me, it was always clear that the more than human animals also had their own opinion on life and the good life, relationships with humans, and yes, many other social and political issues from my own experience of living with them and also reading about them, thinking about them. But when I began to study philosophy, and before that I already studied arts and was interested in animals in that direction as well, but it became more concrete when I studied philosophy, and I found out that there were, first of all, that philosophy is mainly a matter of human beings thinking about human beings, but that there was also quite a lot of prejudice about non-human animal capacities, and that there were many misunderstandings about the ways that we relate to animals and also the ways that we should relate to animals. And I think that my interest in, because I was interested both in language and in politics. And with both of these concepts, you find that humans mostly delineated them in relation to humans. So when humans think about politics, when humans think about language, they think about human politics and human language. And we find this so normal, it's so much part of our everyday lives, that we don't even give it a second thought. And well, of course, we share the planet with all kinds of other animals who also make sense of their lives and discuss that with one another. So yeah, I think that my interest in the question took concrete shape when I began to study philosophy, and yeah, then I found that there was sort of something missing in the way we think about these concepts as humans, and that there was a very strange attitude towards the other animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you talk about how in the history of philosophy, there's been a lot of kind of definition of language as human language, and defining the animal as, you know, the brutes without language. But you know, you talk about how this isn't really true, and you go through lots of examples of animal communication and language, from alarm calls to chimpanzees using sign language to, you know, dogs bowing to signal intent to play. And so in all your, and I know you've written, you know, other books on animal language as well. So in all your research on this topic, you know, what has looking at other animals taught you about language?
Well, I think that language is not one thing, also not in the case of humans. So, for example, academics use a very specific kind of language to write about life and animals and whatever else they write about, which is very different from the way that language works in poetry, or the way that language works in everyday encounters with your neighbors, that are often repetitive and kind of, words don't always mean very much, but they have more of a sort of friendly function to signal friendliness. And the same is true in relation to other animals. There are many different ways in which non-human animals use language that are sometimes species specific, sometimes multi-species, sometimes involve humans as well. So it in certain language games, humans and other animals both contribute to the meaning that that is created. And I think this word language, and this is something that Wittgenstein, the philosopher, also wrote a lot about, this word language sort of deceives us, because we immediately think we know what we're talking about, but we don't really, because it actually means a lot of different things under different circumstances and in relation to different beings. And this idea that language is one thing that we can give a universal definition of has been very dominant in philosophy of language. And in that field, language was also equated with human language. And when that is your starting point, it's going to be very hard to understand the languages of other animals. So if you think that language is one thing, that there's one universal definition that is always true for every language everywhere, then not only you obscure what language is and does and what it can do, but also close off the way to other forms of meaning making that might or might not be language. And I think we live in a very interesting time because there's a lot of research about how other animals speak with one another, sometimes using sounds, sometimes using scents or color patterns on their skin, like the Caribbean reef squid who really speak with color patterns, changing color patterns on their skin. And of course, there's a lot that we do not know, but I think that all of that research on animal languages that are sometimes species specific, but also can differ between different communities, that research really makes the whole idea of language so much more lively and interesting and rich. And I think that because I work as a human being also in different human language games. So I'm an academic philosopher, but I also engage in the public debate. So I write for newspapers over here in the Netherlands. I write novels. My first book of poetry is coming out in a couple of months. I'm a songwriter. So since I was 14 years old or something, I've been writing songs, performing them on stage. So I think that language is really magical, and it really has the power to do many different things. And I'm also quite aware of the fact that how you use language as a human really determines the meaning of what you say. So there's a lot that cannot be expressed in academic work, for example, and novels are better suited for. But I think that this idea that language is not one thing, that it can mean something else in different language games, helps with understanding how other animals create meaning.
Yeah, you talk about how language can create shared worlds between species as well. And one of the examples I read this book when it came out, so I think that was maybe almost 4 years ago, and that has really stuck with me, that I bring up often in conversation, is you talk about this human and dog in Wyoming, Ted Karasote and his dog Merle. Do you remember their story and kind of the significance of it?
Yeah, I think that it was Sue Donaldson, by the way, who recommended this book to me, one of the co-authors of the book Zoopolis, which was quite influential for me too, and that I forgot to mention when you were asking me about how this whole project got started. But anyway, in this book, the interesting thing is that humans very often presume that other animals are somehow tied to their biological capacities and stuck in their life world, while humans are capable of overcoming patterns that they are stuck in their lives, or some have some kind of flexibility for growth and change and learning. And this book, which is about a dog called Merle, really shows that other animals too can change, and humans can support that, witness it, and be part of it. So what happens in the story is that Merle finds Karasote when he's out camping somewhere. So the dog agency is immediately there in the beginning of the story, and Karasote brings Merle home. They live together, and when he lives in a small town where most dogs roam freely, he decides to give Merle more space, and this means that Merle needs to learn the rules of the town. So he can't go after cattle. He needs to be careful around traffic. There are some other specific situations that he needs to learn to deal with. And once he's capable of that, Karasote installs a dog door in the door of his house so that Merle can come and go and be with his friends as he pleases, or stay at home. And what he describes is that more freedom on the side of the dog actually enriches their relationship, and that this also allows the dog in question to make better choices, become smarter and more, wise and present in their relationship. And it's a good illustration, I think, of how we can work towards more freedom for other animals, for animal companions, in a way that is doable and also somehow responsible.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot more room for freedom and agency in other animals' lives that, we could give them if we thought to, or but usually aren't thinking to.
Yes, and I think that this is also something that the other animals can teach us, because in my own life I had a sort of the opposite story with my companion Ollie, who was a street dog from Romania, and he lived on the streets for the first years of his life, and then he was caught by dog catchers, lived in a shelter, quite a bad shelter over there. But when he came to Amsterdam, he was around 5 or 6 years old. And he'd never lived in a house before, nor had a close relationship with a human before. So we needed to create a lot of understanding, and he needed to adjust to a situation that was, in a sense, much less free, at least in the negative sense of freedom. But he was very eager to make something of it. And with him, I really experienced, because I didn't teach him or train him, this would have been rude, because he was an adult. He had already his own norms and values and ideas about relationship, including moral ideas. He just had very good ideas about how to interact with others, and also taught me a lot in that regard. And I think that on the one hand, the story is perhaps the opposite, because he needed to learn to walk on the leash, which is a restriction of his freedom, but which also turned out to be a tool for the liberation. And I think that for him, the ideal situation would have been much more like Karasoti's example. But this was not possible in the Netherlands. It's too crowded here in nearly all areas, and it's also not allowed. But then, that's something that you can choose to obey or not. But I think that it's also an example of how you can learn to live together with others, and that in these kinds of relationships, the human being changes too, because very often when we think about social and political change and non-human animals, it kind of feels like they need to learn something or to change in order to establish better relations or something. But I think that it's mostly the other way around, that humans need to change. And I also think that if you embark on such a project with another animal, that you are quite likely to change.
Yeah, so I think, even if we accept that, other animals communicate, they have language, and that, in these kind of maybe micro individual settings that they can, change and be changed in their relationships with humans, the skeptic is going to say, well, that's still not politics. They're still not political agents. They can't watch a debate and then go out and vote for their preferred candidate. But maybe that's a limited conception of what politics is. So what are the ways in which, animal agency manifests in political ways?
Well, I think that you already begin to give an answer with when you said, yeah, that's a restrictive way of thinking about politics. So a lot of people think of politics as voting, or perhaps attending a street demonstration, or perhaps doing some kind of internet activism. But in fact, there are, of course, lots of different political practices that humans take part in, and many of these also can be found in the lives of animals. So a very easy to understand example is resistance. There's a great deal of literature about animal resistance. Jason Rebel, for example, wrote a lot about this, and he shows by carefully describing how wild animals resist in circuses, zoos, and other places where they are forced to work for humans, that resistance is not accidental, but very often structural, that animals cooperate to resist, and that they also shape human practices. So Rebel also discusses the resistance of farmed animals and animals, for example, working as soldiers in the army, and shows that by their acts, by being unreliable workers, for example, they pushed humans into certain directions, and sometimes this led to ending the oppression and exploitation of these animals, and sometimes not. So resistance is a practice that you find in many animal species. Dinesh Wadiwal wrote about the resistance of fish. Probably small animals also resist in their own ways. There are different forms of resisting, actual fighting or physical resistance, but it can also mean avoiding humans or changing behavior in a certain way. And there are other practices too in which animal political behavior resembles humans, or in which animals cooperate with humans. There are very interesting experiments at the moment being done in animal sanctuaries, such as Fine Sanctuary, in which humans and other animals collectively co-govern the multi-species communities. So this means that the sanctuaries are set up in such a way that humans are not the ones who determine everything, but that the acts of animals, their relationships, the roles they take on in society, the habits they may create with others, co-create how these communities function and are governed. And then there is also the possibility of, sort of anarchist animal practices. So animals who choose to live differently than humans do, and who may turn away from humans, or ignore them, or set up their own counter communities and practices in the midst of human domination. And these can be found with street animals, but also birds. Patrice Jones, who's also the founder of Fine Sanctuary, wrote a really nice article about birds as anarchists. So there are different ways in which we can think about animals and politics. Some authors focus more on how they can participate in human political practices, for example, using liberal democratic ideas and institutions, such as, for example, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, and other authors focus more on the counter practices that I just described. But it all means it all asks for reinterpreting the concepts at stake in relation to other animals, and also reforming them together with other animals. So you can't simply say this is democracy and then use a human conception of democracy and stick it onto the other animals and see how they fit in. When you take a concept such as democracy, you need to really carefully unpack its meaning in a multi-species context. So it always means reinterpreting the concept, but still human concepts that we have, human political concepts, can play a role in refiguring relationships with the other animals.
Yeah, so maybe as a good example of this, because it's come up in this interview and it's been mentioned in other interviews I've done, there's a very influential book by Will Kimmelka and Sue Donaldson called Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights. And they sort other animals into three political categories. And I was wondering if we could just go through kind of one by one and talk about the strengths and shortcomings of their approach. So the first idea they have is citizenship essentially for domesticated animals, so dogs, cats, and horses, as well as chickens, pigs, and cows, and others. What is meant by citizenship here, and what do you think of this category?
Well, I think this sort of follows what I was just saying. So on the one hand, we need to think about what citizenship means for other animals. Donaldson and Kimlicka, for example, mention the right to healthcare, but also the right to political voice. So non-human domesticated animals should have a say in the questions that concern their lives and that concern how the community functions. At the same time, once we are going to live with other animals in this way, I think what we now view as citizenship is going to change quite thoroughly, because it means that we would live in a very different world. Infrastructure would be very different. Our lives would look different in terms of consumption, of where we live, how we share the space with others. So I think that we can use human citizenship sort of as a starting point for thinking about rights and obligations with these animals. But then once we begin to do it, and I think that some people are thinking about these models quite seriously, for example, in the sanctuary context, things are going to really change. And one of the interesting things about the citizenship approach and the categorization of animals is that once we are going to treat the other animals better, so give domesticated animals more freedom and not terrorize wild animals anymore, these categories are going to change, because I think that many domesticated animals are going to leave. It's not for nothing that we now have rabbits in cages and birds and I don't know who else, and that we lock companions up in houses. So they're going to go out and probably become more wild. And at the same time, if we stop hunting wild animals and invading their territories and scaring them, they are going to be a lot more open towards humans. So while this idea of dividing up animals in these different categories based on the social relations that they have with humans is really important, and in theory, because it opens up the way to thinking about animals as social groups, and it really acknowledges animal agency too. But it's going to lead to a very interesting situation in which human relations with humans and other animals are going to change very much.
Yeah, I think that's a nice lead into their second category, which is, what they call these liminal animals. So creatures who aren't, in our homes domesticated, but who still share space with human societies. Think, rats, pigeons, raccoons, and politically they classify these as denizens. So who are these denizens, and what's the role of this category in society?
Well, I think that in the literature, in the animal rights literature and the animal ethics literature, there's very often a distinction between domesticated animals and wild animals. And what Donaldson and Kimlicka rightly say is that there are also a lot of animals who sort of fall in between these two categories, like crows and house mice and all kinds of creatures. And they say that these animals should also have a place to live, even though their rights to certain spaces are really depend on the context and also the history of the relationships involved, and that they should have some specific rights, like the right not to be stereotyped, and also to engage in certain relationships with humans, reciprocal relationships that are different from those with domesticated animals. So the interesting thing about this category is indeed that I think a lot of animals will become liminal if humans, because liminal animals also generally have more agency and autonomy in their lives, because they are not so dependent on humans. And some animals already go from domesticated to liminal, as in the example of feral cats. And sometimes animals make the transition the other way. For example, when feral cats go and live in a house when they are old or something. So this could be a very interesting category for the future. But I think that, in a sense, I mean, because the third category that Donaldson and Kimlicka describe are wild animals, and they propose to view them as suffering communities. And I think that's helpful too, in a sense, to think about ways in which humans are responsible for harms done to wild animals, but still should protect their autonomy and agency as communities. But I think that in this model, it's also so what I really like about zoopolis, what I find really important, is that that Donaldson and Kimlicka show how political concepts can shed light on our relationships with non-humans. And the concepts that they use, citizenship, sovereignty, denizensship for liminal animals, provide lenses through which we can look at these groups. But at the same time, because relationships really vary, if you think about wild animals, maybe people think about deer or wolves, but there are many wild animals. Are worms wild animals? And are insects wild animals, or are they liminal? So I think within these categories, the concepts are going to mean something else depending on the context. And there's another problem, and that is that we don't know enough about how animal political communities are organized. So there's a lot of attention right now for animal languages. There's also a lot of attention for animal cultures. And both of these topics show that there's actually much more going on in terms of social and political relationships in animal communities. And these communities have many shapes. They may function more or less democratically. When animals speak, I also discuss some examples of animal democratic action, like voting, because some animals do actually vote and make group decisions in democratic ways. But being more precise about what it means to share the world with such a diversity of species. And we haven't even discussed plants, because new research about plants also asks us to rethink concepts like language and perhaps politics. But doing justice to the ways in which other animals live their lives, form their communities, and relate to human communities asks us to be very specific. And human concepts like citizenship, sovereignty, and so on can definitely be a guide, specifically because the world is so dominated by humans. So we are responsible for change, and our existing institutions and concepts can help us think about that change. But in order to know what they are going to actually mean in a multi-species context, we're going to have to engage differently with these other animals. And this does not mean studying them in more detail, because that can be colonial too, and we've done that for a long time. And we might need to do it in some contexts to know how to best deal with certain situations and conflicts, but it mostly means living differently with them, because that will give us a better view of what they want from humans. So I think that when we think about social and political change, we kind of want to solve it ourselves as humans always. And in the case of non-human animals, this is really problematic, because they have their own ideas about how we can share the world and be better animals as humans. So I think that our job here is, of course, to do the conceptual analysis and think critically about concepts in a multi-species context, but also doing a lot of listening and retreating as humans.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, maybe let's think about what that interspecies democracy could actually look like. I think because, as we talked about earlier, a lot of human democracies, certainly in the United States, but a lot more emphasis on representation than participation. Everyday people don't necessarily play an active role shaping policy. They just kind of vote for the people who do. And I think the most maybe obvious kind of low-hanging fruit ideas people have had for including animals in politics are kind of similarly having a human represent them, whether they have a proxy vote in Parliament or an office of an ombudsperson or something like that. How, these may or may not be good ideas on their own, but how can we go beyond them?
I was recently asked to speak about citizens' assemblies in the city of Gouda, which is a small Dutch town, and they want to think about citizens' participation in politics, because over here in the Netherlands there's quite a large gap between politicians and citizens, and this is really this leads to different problems. There's quite a lot of polarization in politics, in the public debate. It's hard to figure out how to democratically make decisions in the context of climate change. We have a nitrogen crisis, which is caused by intensive animal agriculture over here in the Netherlands, and that's European legislation is now forcing us to change that, but there's a lot of resistance, for example, from Dutch farmers. So there's many groups of humans do not feel heard in the Netherlands, and there's kind of a lack of decision making in the context of the large ecological crisis that we are facing. So different cities, including Gouda, are now thinking about citizens' assembly, citizens' participation to solve some of these problems democratically on a local level, and perhaps also on a national level, because they're also thinking about installing this in the national context, as they did in Paris too some time ago. But then the Citizens Assembly worked really well, but their advice wasn't listened to by the government. So in any case, I was asked to come to Gouda to speak about citizens' assemblies in the context of animals and nature. So I gave a talk about multi-species citizens' assemblies. And multi-species can mean two things. It can either mean that humans should have a say in that different human citizens should have a say about ecological issues or green issues in their area, but it can also mean that non-human agents like animals, perhaps trees and others, can play a role in deliberation about certain issues and perhaps also decision making. So when you look at these cases on the local level, and this can be very local, like an animal sanctuary or a farm or a nature reserve, or it can also be a city, then there are different actors who each play a role in how the society is formed, in how decisions are made, that all sort of influence what goes on ecologically within a certain setting. And sometimes deliberation with non-human actors can be direct. For example, when you ask a cow where she wants to graze or whom she wants to be with, or these kinds of very concrete questions that you can speak about with other animals, and sometimes they might be more indirect and ask for more interpretation on the side of humans. For example, when you're dealing with a natural entity like the sea. But I think that in general, this interest for citizens' assemblies, that is not only here in the Dutch context, but that you see in many other spaces, provides a new and interesting lens to think about how we can include the voices of non-humans and specifically animals in processes of decision making about the future. Also because we very often already do it. So in lots of decisions that are made on the local level, for example, building houses in a certain area, there is already some acknowledgement of non-human animal agency and rights to land, for example, in the case of nesting birds or certain bats. Bats are protected animals in the Netherlands. So we already have some mechanisms for that. And of course, then these, in the context of representative democracy, then the insights from these citizens' assemblies can either be translated to policies or laws or other more human institutions. But perhaps this is also a time in which we are finding out that the way in which we think about doing politics is not so sustainable and not so good for humans too, because a lot of the questions that we are dealing with, for example, in the context of climate change, transcend national borders. So they ask for more cooperation in a global context and another kind of communication too. And at the same time, we find this great gap between those who live in the world and those who make the decisions. And so there needs to happen something on the local level too. And one thing that we haven't mentioned so far is that much of this is not simply political, but also intertwined with economic interests, because of course, capitalism structures a lot of how we think about politics too, and also, obstructs change when it comes to non-human animals. Simply, I mean, a lot of humans want to change something, but then humans greatly profit from the exploitation of animals, and companies want to keep the status quo intact because they want to make more profit. So yes, there are different models for thinking about the political participation of non-human animals, and I think that there's more attention from the anarchist side too now for thinking about animal democracy, which is good. And at the same time, we also need humans to take responsibility on the national and international level, and the great power of companies over all of these processes.
Yeah, I think one of the powerful ideas here is, that we need kind of a systemic transformation of what our democracy is and how we think about it, from something that happens, in isolated meetings and votes, to this deliberative process, this participatory process that's going on in different ways kind of all the time. And that this maybe more participatory, deliberative version of democracy is not only a way of bringing other animals into the process, but also just kind of more democratic, and gives more power to everyday humans as well. And yeah, I think it's fun to think about kind of different ways that plays out. Another example from the book that I think about often is, as you mentioned, these horses who were taught to use like pictogram symbols to communicate, for instance, whether or not they wanted a blanket. And it makes you wonder whether, could they express whether they want to be ridden, whether they want to be inside or outside, maybe whether they want to be in captivity at all. And it made me think about, these buttons people are getting for their dogs and cats, where the dog can click, or my friend's cat loves her outside button because she always wants to go outside, or the dog, maybe hits the treat button or whatever. But do you, what do you think of the potential for kind of these maybe more innovative or newer ways of trying to interpret what other animals want?
Well, I think that we already know what other animals want. Most of the animals, most of the mammals alive now live in intensive agriculture. They don't want that, so we know that. And I think that I read an article yesterday about parrots that are parrots in captivity that are given the option to call other parrots in captivity using a kind of interface, but they're actually speaking to other parrots. And the researchers said some things and they got the idea in COVID times, because humans felt less lonely when they were speaking to other humans with video calls and these kinds of things. So the researchers thought, let's do that with lonely parrots. And yes, the parrots like it, and they call each other very often. And the parrots who make a lot of calls also get a lot of calls back. And this is such a horrific example of how you can do something about the loneliness of parrots, because it shows it fully shows that yes, they are lonely and they do want contact, but we inflict this on them. We keep them in captivity, so we should remedy the captivity and not give them the opportunity to give video calls. And you have the same thing about Tinder for zoo animals, so that they can find their own partner instead of being forced to be with a partner that they don't want to have sex with, because humans want animals in zoos to have sex with each other, but then also they not too often, because then the zoo animals are of course killed. But these things they have something very horrible in it. And I think that the cat and dog buttons may seem more benign, but at the same time, we it's also, we already know what they want if we look at them. I mean, cats have a very good way of showing they want to go outside, namely they walk to the door or they look at you,
Right. Right.
So it's and I think that on the one hand it can be a playful way of getting to know your companion better. And with my dog companion Doris, I went to the dog school a lot because she likes it, and we do the exercises, and it's just a way of it's a form of play, or a form of having some happy time together, doing a game or something. But it's not the answer to the problems that many animals have. And I think that humans find it hard to come to terms. It's very, very hard to live with companion animals and to make them happy. I mean, with cats, when they go outside, it's easier because they can hang out with their cat friends and lead their own lives apart from us. But with dogs, and I mean, all the animals that humans keep in their houses and gardens, and they have fences around, it's very, very difficult. I adopted a lot of ex-laboratory mice, 25 in total, in different groups, and I find it very hard to deal with the fact that they live in captivity and they'd rather not. And there's also not a possibility to really change that unless they are old, because then they can sort of walk around. But they can't. I can't rewild them or anything. And it's taught me a lot about the inner lives of mice, about their practices of care, because they are very good carers, and they have a lot of ways of communicating with each other and with me. And a mouse is definitely not a mouse, so it did teach me that. But it's also very hard, and it's very sad, because they usually do not live to be much older than 2 years old, so they die. They die often as well, but every day they show me how difficult it is to live with others that you are responsible for. And I think that the more you read about other animals, the harder it gets. And technology, humans often turn to technology as a way of, I don't know, not having to make certain decisions. Oh, we need more technology and then we'll know what to do. Or, oh, yes, technology might solve this problem, or technology might solve that problem. And of course, sometimes we do find out things using a technology. It's the same in relation to humans, but it's there's a great sadness to it as well. And it shouldn't stand in the way of actually attending to animals.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And maybe we could, answer was a lot about captive or domestic animals, and maybe we can have one more question about the book with regard to wild animals, and talk about what it looks like to, engage democratically with wild populations. And you have a case study in your book that's about this conflict between wild geese in an airport. Feel free to use that example or any other. But kind of what would you say are important first steps we could take to start engaging democratically with wild populations?
I think a very important first step is to recognize them as a party in the conflict or the situation that you are dealing with. Because what happens now is that humans very often make the decision for them, so not with them. So in the case I discussed with the wild geese in the Netherlands, there's a conflict between humans and geese. I think that humans perceive it as a conflict mostly, but then the geese do experience harm. So there were not so many wild geese in the Netherlands. until the 1970s, but then because of changes in the landscape, and also fertilizers of the grass, and also shooting of foxes, all kinds of reasons, there became more and more and more geese. And now they are seen as a plague, and it sometimes leads to specific dangerous situations, for example, around the airport, even though there the danger is not just for the humans, but obviously for the geese too. But there's also a problem with farmers who don't want them on their land. And what you find is that in this case, many groups of humans speak to each other. So policymakers, farmers, companies like Schiphol Airport, activists. But then the geese are also active agents. They are creative beings who learn throughout their lives. They have they have a lot of social relationships that matter to them, and they have their own kinds of knowledge. So the first step in solving this, because what the Dutch people always do when they have a problem with animals is that they kill them. So they shoot them, but it doesn't work because geese fly. So when the land stays the same, new groups of geese will come and settle there. So it doesn't work, and it's also violent and unjust. So another way could be recognizing that the geese are active agents with their own ideas about the land, who make maps in their mind of the land and think about nice places to settle, and speak to them through landscape design, or perhaps interventions with robot birds in spaces that are dangerous or harmful either to humans or to the geese. I mean, a very important step for the humans is as well to accept the presence of other animals, and appreciate them instead of viewing them as a pest. But this is of course not always possible, and then you need to negotiate, and that begins with recognizing the other as another, and then with thinking about creative solutions together with these animals. So it's kind of a trial and error situation in which you can investigate what the alternatives are in guiding the geese in a certain way, asking them to do something, responding to their acts. And the thing is that geese, of course, also discuss these things with each other. So once you've made it clear to them that this is the situation, or they made that clear to us, then they will also tell that to other geese, and hopefully they will adjust to the new situation. And I think that recognizing other animals as others in these kinds of situations just really changes the starting point of the situation, and opens up new venues for action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been talking about your nonfiction book, but you're also a visual artist, a songwriter, and a novelist. So with our last few minutes, I thought we could talk about fiction, and what are you able to do and say in your novels that maybe you aren't able to do in a nonfiction book, like When Animals Speak?
I think for me, it's sort of, in my own life, it went the other way around. So I began by writing stories and songs and fiction and making other things. And then at a certain point, I felt the need to be more argumentative, or to be able to articulate a different kind of argument about relationships between humans and other animals. And I found philosophy and academic philosophy helpful for that. So what I said before is that how you say something really matters for what you can say. And I think that novels are very good at showing the ambiguities of life and the difficulties of life, and appeal more to a sense of appeal more to people's feelings and also their sense of beauty and wonder or something, where philosophy is much more about trying to say something that is solid and fixed, and of course it's never fully that. So there's always air coming in and out. It's never really a wall or something, but it's a very different way of saying something. And I think that the novels are also perhaps better at showing people how we can do it, in how we can live differently with other animals, or the different worlds that are already sort of hiding behind the world that we see in front of us. And yeah, I think that I'm quite fortunate in the sense that I can do these different things, because it takes me places too.
Yeah, I'm curious about how how and whether you seek to depict other animals' voice and agency and other species' voice and agency in fiction, and kind of what that, I don't know, if you have a process for doing that or a way of thinking about that as a human writing other voices.
I never think about what I do, and this is true true for my novels and also for my academic work. So I just sit down and do it. And I think that in my last novel, which is about the sea, the North Sea flooding the Netherlands, and it's not been translated into English yet, but it's it came out in the Netherlands here last year. I wrote about the sea as a protagonist, and also about all the other animals living in the sea, but also the humans as animals. And so what happens is that the sea comes onto the land 1 kilometer a day, so it sort of gradually takes over the country. And some people read it as a dystopian book. Some people read it as a sort of critique of Dutch politics, because it also relies a bit on how politicians responded to the COVID pandemic. But some people really see kind of the movement of nature speaking back, and the voices of all of the other animals and plants and others that gain volume, that take up space. But that's not. It's never something that I think about beforehand. I think that the work also has its own agency, and that the important part for me as a writer is to be porous and listen to that. There is one project that I'm doing in which I am more actively engaging with non-human agency, and that's a multi-species art collective that I formed with a human artist, Gijsje Heemskerk, and our dog companions. And in this art collective, we create artworks that are multi-species, but we also conceive of the world and our audience as a multi-species place. So we also make art for the other animals, often working in specific locations and with specific communities. So that's kind of, it's both a research project and an art project. So, but there we are really thinking a lot about how to deal with all of the different voices involved, and how to deal with different forms of artistic agency, and also how to respectfully engage with others as human artists in certain areas.
Cool. Are any of your novels available in English?
Yeah, Bird Cottage is available in English, and if people are interested, they can always go to my website and look up the different projects there.
Great. I'll include a link to your website. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think we discussed quite a lot. So now it's time to do it. I think that everybody listening to this podcast has the power to make some kind of change. And, sometimes the things we do feel very small, like living with the laboratory mice as I do, or I also have a group that assists the frogs and toads across the road when they come out of hibernation. I have a group of volunteers assisting. And these things may feel small for us, but for the other animals, they mean everything. And better understanding that we share the world with many others who have their own worlds, and tending to multi-species life worlds is a way in which we can make a difference. And it's really the only thing we can do.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, again, please consider supporting this podcast with a small monthly donation on Patreon. A link to my Patreon page is in the episode description, along with a link to Eva's website. She mentioned Vine Sanctuary in our conversation. I'm hoping to interview someone from either that sanctuary or another one to talk about how, animals are able to choose and self-direct their lives to some extent in the sanctuary setting for a future episode. But that will not be the next episode. Next, we're looking at a movie and a novel in which, as Dr. Ian Malcolm puts it, life finds a way. So hope you're looking forward to that. You can get early access to that and other episodes, again, by subscribing on Patreon, or you can just wait. Should be out by the end of May. And hope you have a great day.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.